Thank you for agreeing to talk about your recollections with regard to the World Bank and its role in the carbon market. My recollection of first interacting with you was when you were in the Dutch government and were responsible for looking at the possibility of the World Bank engaging in creation of the prototype carbon fund. And I wanted to get from you what your recollections were and what your thinking was at that time.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to participate in this conversation, also for the information and hopefully enlightenment of future generations. So, as we were in the run-up to 1997 negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, we knew that we were negotiating a legal instrument which would only contain obligations for industrialized countries and not for developing countries. But at the same time, we knew that whatever industrialized countries would do on their own would not be enough, given our understanding at that time of the climate change challenge. So we knew already then that we had to increase the level of ambition. We knew that a way of increasing the level of ambition would be to also undertake emission reduction activities, maybe not under an obligation, but emission reduction activities in developing countries, because that was where the major growth in emissions was projected to grow, and we felt we had the opportunity there to change emission paths and maybe prevent things before they had happened. So we wanted to find ways of engaging developing countries, and I'm saying this on film, but don't quote me on this. One of the things that we wanted to do was to make it attractive for developing countries to engage in the Kyoto Protocol and to come to that instrument. And our sense was that if we could offer market-based mechanisms which would be a way of A, transferring financial resources to developing countries, B, modernizing the economy of developing countries, and C, contributing to sustainable development, that would be a wonderful way to get developing countries excited about engagement. And our sense was that the Clean Development Mechanism would be a perfect instrument to do that, to create that kind of excitement and achieve all of those objectives. But much to our surprise, there was a huge resistance on the part of developing countries to the notion of flexibility mechanisms. First of all, because they felt that we would be pulling the rug from under them, in the sense of taking the low-hanging fruit of cheap emission reductions, and then when later it would become their turn to take on obligations as well, they would only be left with the more expensive options. Secondly, there was a lot of talk at the time about carbon colonialism, that this was, especially the Brazilians were very good at that, saying that these mechanisms were a way of interfering in their sovereignty and grabbing pieces of their territory. India, which has always been very good on principles, felt that the atmosphere belonged to everyone, and you shouldn't be trying to turn that into a commodity that you buy and sell. So there was actually a lot of resistance to these flexibility mechanisms, and a lot of developing countries wondering, should we be getting into this? And my long-standing experience in life is that the best way to get people excited about something is to prove that it works, to show that it can be done and to show that it can be attractive. So at that time, I worked very closely with Ian Johnson, who was then the vice president for all of this in the World Bank, basically with the idea of setting up the first carbon fund, the prototype carbon fund, and using that, if you will, as a carrot to entice people in, or as a way of demonstrating that it could be made to work. So we worked together very closely at that time to set this thing up, including in Kyoto itself. One of the things I remember is that that Ian had organized a dinner in a very fancy hotel during the Kyoto conference, to which he had invited me, and I, as usual, arrived late. I always arrived late, and found this to be a traditional Japanese restaurant where I had to take my shoes off, and then discovered that I had a big hole in my sock and my big toe was emerging through it. But that didn't, so that was one evening where we were really working on countries, lobbying on countries to get this set up. So the bank was very instrumental in taking the initiative to do that, to be out front in organizing this, which I'm sure, and I wasn't privy to that, but must have given the bank a lot of flack from the developing country members. But nonetheless, Ian and the team pressed ahead. So that, I think, was one instrumental way of actually getting people excited about the notion of flexibility mechanisms. And the other thing that was interesting, and I don't know if it was ever actually repeated, was that first fund, the Prototype Carbon Fund, was actually a partnership between the public and the private sector, in the sense that a number of governments, including mine, including the Dutch government, put money into the fund, but a number of corporations did as well. So it was, I think, led by the bank, a first in terms of market-based mechanisms, and maybe also a first in terms of public-private cooperation in the area of climate change. And once the Prototype Carbon Fund was up and running, I think it proved the soundness of the theory, in the sense that in no time people were lining up, or countries were lining up around the block to obtain access to this facility. Mm. So now I've given you an incredibly long answer, and you probably have no questions left.
No, it's just a starting point. Ivo. What would you say were the main strengths of the bank, because of which governments such as yours, and you were instrumental in catalyzing all the governments to come together, particularly the Nordic ones and even Japan. What is it about the bank that made it attractive institution to move this forward?
Well, a number of things. The first is that I think, climate negotiators at that time were a bunch of hippies, and they all came out of environment ministries. And they didn't have a clue what economics was or market-based mechanisms was. They probably thought that was all perfidious stuff invented either by capitalists or other outrageous people. And one of the advantages of the bank was that it traditionally has a network in a different domain. It hasn't a domain obviously in the banking sector, in the public finance sector, in the sector of ministries of finance. So the bank provided an opportunity to access a community which was essential to success. And I built on that actually a number of years later, together with Bob Zellick, when we had one of the many climate change conferences in Bali, and in the run-up to that, I had the feeling that if we didn't manage to engage finance ministers, then we would never get serious about climate action. So I got together then with Sri Mulyani, who was then Indonesia's Minister of Finance, and subsequently with Bob Zellick, to bring finance ministers and development ministers to Bali, which we did. And that led to the Bali breakfast and the subsequent engagement. But similarly, I think, in those early days, the strength of the bank was that it was able to tap into that constituency. And secondly, what was very important for me was that in the bank we had a partner that brought a pipeline, a potential pipeline of projects. Because the last thing you want to do is to set up a fund like this and then have to go hunting for projects and probably end up with not terribly good ones. And by partnering with the bank, I knew that we would be able to tap into the country level infrastructure, into the existing relationships of the bank, into the project portfolio, and that we had also the potential of really blending resources, of taking the money that would be coming in through the Prototype Carbon Fund and mixing it with the loan, soft loan, risk guarantee, other financial instruments of the bank. So maybe that was actually when the notion of blended finance was even born. So those, I think, are two key strengths of two key strengths of the bank.
Okay. And in terms of the bank's delivery of the Prototype Carbon Fund, what were the things that the bank did well? In terms of, lot of the expectation was placed on, the portfolio that the World Bank had access to. But in reality, if you looked at the result, it was one area where it was not very successful to blend carbon finance with its own lending program.
Yeah.
Were there other factors like that you think the bank could have done better on integrating the whole business in a better way, or did it do the best it could under the circumstances?
Well, you're probably going to cut this out of the final film, but I think one of the shortcomings of the bank, in fact of many of the development banks, is that they are what we call in Dutch two souls in a single breast. Mm-hmm. So you have on the one hand the country operations, the lending operations of the bank, which are very hands-on, which are very result-oriented, which are up to their knees in the mud getting stuff done. And then you have the theoretical or policy part of the bank, very often around the vice presidents for sustainability, the people that are sitting in Washington, D.C., and those two components of the bank don't always communicate ideally. So I think there was a lot of support from the President and a lot of support in Washington, D.C. for the notion of establishing this, but that doesn't automatically mean that you have buy-in at the country level. And in a highly professional organization, the fact that the boss says something needs to happen doesn't automatically mean that it gets done. Mm. So it was a struggle, I think, at the beginning to get that pipeline, to get that up and running. Plus, different skills are required at different stages of a process. And Ian Johnson and a number of the people that were around him in those early days were very good at building momentum, at creating political buy-in, at organizing the process to get the thing up and running, getting countries and companies to contribute. But they were not the natural deliverers. They were not the natural engineers, the project pipeline people. And I think once there were some personnel evolutions in the process as well, Ken Newcomb came in with much more of a hands-on delivery attitude that things began to speed up. Okay.
In terms of the private sector capacity and engagement, you clearly mentioned that the initial Prototype Carbon Fund, for instance, had more than a dozen private sector entities in addition to the government support. Was there a sense that this was going to be a true public-private partnership, or how did the private sector see the bank's engagement in this area of trying to catalyze the carbon markets?
To be honest, I don't think the private sector companies were so much interested in catalyzing the carbon market. I think a number of the companies, especially to be frank, the Japanese companies, were interested in exploring cheap ways to be in compliance. Mm. So they were hoping that this would create a mechanism which would be an alternative, a cost-effective alternative for them to domestic action. So that applies very much to the Japanese. And a number of the Nordics, especially the Norwegians, already then had realized that they are an incredibly carbon-intensive economy, that they would like to stay a carbon-intensive economy for the time being, but at the same time felt a global obligation to act on climate change, and understood already then that they would need to do it in other people's countries and in other ways than closing Norwegian oil and gas operations. So they also saw it as a compliance instrument. So I think that played a significant role for a number of them. Yeah, and there were probably companies at the table as well. I know a number of the European companies who saw this, probably wrongly, but who saw this maybe as an opportunity over time to also engage as delivery partners.
Yeah. And after the prototype carbon fund, the Dutch government was the first off the block with the country funds and fairly large, substantial commitments and support, which actually led the carbon market from our perspective inside the World Bank at that time to be established as more than just one-off product. And again, you were instrumental in that. I'd like to get your thoughts on what, from a perspective of Netherlands, was the reason to engage, because it was not a one-off engagement with the bank. You started with the ERUPT and the SIRUP programs, and it was at that time the deepest commitment to the market instruments among any country, and you were leading that whole process. So I'd like to get your perspective, if going back almost 20 years, but just what was it that made you push that so effectively within your own government system and therefore create an international momentum?
Well, you know, the Dutch, if the Dutch can get a front row seat for half the price, then they'll always do it. So. But I mean, we knew that we had a very advanced, yes, carbon intensive, but also extremely efficient economy, and that the cost of compliance at home would be very high. We were under a lot of pressure from Dutch energy intensive industry to yes, be ambitious, but not in their backyard. So to find other solutions. So maybe there wasn't so much a commitment to market-based mechanisms, but there was a commitment to the cheapest possible solution. So at one stage, and bear in mind, A, that I am not an economist, I'm a social scientist, and B, that I was sitting in a Ministry of Environment, not in a Ministry of Economic Affairs or Finance. And suddenly, I was told that I would get 500 million euros to buy carbon credits, which was a significant amount of money to spend in an area that I knew absolutely nothing about. I was talking about this challenge to a colleague, and we managed quite a lot of money in the Environment Ministry. I mean, not that much. And the colleague said to me, a fellow director said to me, you know, if you want to spend $1 million well, you need one staff member. So I'm not very good at maths, but I knew that 1 million times 500 meant 500 staff members. And I wasn't going to hire 500 people. In fact, we ran that whole operation with 4 staff. And our philosophy right from the beginning, I think building on the PCF, was to partner with others, to make the investments through others, to utilize the professional expertise and staff resources of others, and to try and maximize the multiplier of partnering with financial institutions and partnering with the private sector. So we did a lot of partnering with commercial banks as well. and that actually brought us a fantastic multiplier on our investments. We were able to tap into good project pipelines that were investment grade. We were able to draw on the intelligence and the networks of others. So, as is often the case with Dutch people, we managed to get a front row seat for half price.
Yes, you did. Another amazing thing that I can certainly recall was the stability in the people within VROM, as it was called then. For nearly 10, 12 years, we dealt with the same set of people, and over time, Lex and Ferry and became world experts on, leading experts on the carbon market, and gave us a sense of stability and support. I mean, is that something that is helpful in the overall process when you're trying to create something totally new?
It is up to a point. Lex had been, before I hired him, had been working on regulation for large combustion plants. So he was an engineer, he was an expert, and he was also one of the most difficult people that I knew. So I knew that he was not going to make life easy for our partners, which was exactly what I wanted. And then we hired some even more difficult lawyers, Rutger de Boer,
yes.
and of course Reggie and Ferry were there. My personal philosophy in life is that tell people where you want to go, but don't tell them how to get there. So I had very clear performance indicators for that team, and said, you get on with it and deliver it, and I don't care how you deliver as long as you do. So that, I think, gave them, as not terribly senior people in the organization, a lot of room to really shape this themselves. So it became their baby. They were very committed, which is why they stayed around for a very long time. So their stability is good, but too much stability for too long can also lead to tunnel vision. So there's a point where you need to begin to think outside the box, to begin to think about new approaches. So in a sense, and that happened very naturally, it's good that we moved on to a new generation of instruments and innovations, and people retired and moved on to different jobs. So it has various sides.
So, those were the early years, I'd say, probably 1997, Kyoto Protocol to 2005, yeah? The heyday of the carbon market was up till about 2008, and then financial crisis hit, and the end of the commitment period started coming in of the Kyoto Protocol. So, in your view, what were the factors that contributed to the collapse of the carbon market around that time?
A number of factors. One thing is that as compared to the Australians who tried to set up initially a carbon market which was A, very, very restrictive, and B, very large in terms of the engagement, I think the Europeans were smart in the sense that they didn't set the bar too high, and they didn't try and include too many companies. So in that sense, and that got easier buy-in from the private sector to the European emission trading system and get that accepted. And I personally saw that as a lobster trap, in the sense that you create something with a relatively narrow opening. Industry happily swims in, but once they're in, they don't know how to get out, and you can close the size of the opening over time. So I very much saw The first period under the European emission trading scheme being fairly generous and relaxed and easy, and then over time, as ambition levels increased, we could ratchet it up. That was the thinking. But then, as you said, we had the economic crisis, and we had a huge oversupply in the market. So that negatively impacted demand, because a lot of companies could simply spin their wheels and achieve their targets without really doing anything. Secondly, and that's a pity, more and more rubbish started finding its way into the system. Emission reductions which weren't real emission reductions, which should never have been allowed, and I think that created the aversion that we're seeing today in some countries, especially on the part of the European Commission, to have a continuation of the flexibility mechanisms, the difficulties around so-called Article 6 in the current negotiations. So in a way, the economic downturn hurt us, and we killed the goose that laid the golden eggs by not keeping the system top grade, gold standard. I think that those were a couple of, there are a lot more, but a couple of very significant factors. Plus, of course, certainly for compliance units, there was, at the end of the day, very little demand outside the European Union, which was a problem as well.
Yeah, the US and Canada and later on Japan and Australia are not making a serious effort. I think certainly would have contributed. But going
well, interestingly, I mean, so I was allowed to do lots of fun things at that time, and one of the things that I had up and running was a project to buy emission reductions from New Jersey in the United States. So we were going to do joint implementation together with the United States. And all of that stuff was extremely far advanced. And then, of course, the Americans walked away from the Kyoto Protocol. But I found that psychologically interesting, because you can appreciate that you can explain to a Dutch taxpayer why you are buying an emission reduction from Mali or some really poor country, but that you're giving Dutch taxpayers money to the citizens of New Jersey in order to buy an emission reduction is more challenging to explain. But people understood the rationale.
Okay. So as we try to move forward under the Paris Agreement and trying to raise the ambition, and with the hope that market instruments contribute to that process, what do you think are the prospects, and what could be the role of the World Bank in that overall goal?
Well, at the end of the day, the success of a product in the market depends on its attractiveness. So the question is, how can you make these mechanisms attractive to countries going forward? And I think many of the concerns that existed at the time of the Kyoto Protocol around low-hanging fruit and double counting and substandard emission reduction units, that many of those fears are still there. So the first thing I think that the bank can do is to say, well, as we move forward on these markets, everything that we do is going to be gold standard, everything is going to be AAA rated, and I don't use the name gold standard by accident. Secondly, I think it is really important to link the future of the market-based mechanisms to the Sustainable Development Goals. So to demonstrate that market-based mechanisms or foreign money for climate can deliver co-benefits that help you to achieve your Sustainable Development Goals. So the second thing I think the bank can do is to show through its own investment programs how market-based mechanisms can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And thirdly, I think the bank can help around with the politics around that. Because what you see in the negotiations is that many developing countries are hesitant to include references to the Sustainable Development Goals in the language around future market-based mechanisms, because they feel that how they define sustainable development, how they deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals is their prerogative, and they don't want money credits being used to interfere in that. And I think they're absolutely right, but I don't think their concern needs to be valid. I think that you can, if you, the bank, with your money or somebody else's, give a country $100 or $100 million or $1 billion, then you can calculate the Sustainable Development Goal impact of that investment without having to interfere in the business of the country in terms of how exactly they decide to allocate it. So in those three ways, I think the bank can make a critical contribution moving forward. And I think in a large number of other ways as well. I've always assumed that money is not evil, that money is not sexist, and that money is not racist. Money will go where it can get the best return on investment at the lowest possible risk in the largest possible market. And I think that there is a great deal that the bank can do using its other skills, programs and abilities to reduce the risk of investing towards climate action and towards the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, many of the risks that are standing in the way of innovation are actually non-financial risks, risks related to bad policy. Bad policy is not made by people complain about environmentally harmful policies. I don't think environmentally harmful policies were created to harm the environment. They were created to serve some other purpose. Mm-hmm. So I think that there are important things that the bank can do to help countries to understand the barriers that are standing in the way of innovation in investments.
And you talked a little bit about the quality of the carbon assets that go into the market, and I do want to give you a direct opportunity to talk about independent international standards as opposed to multilateral standards, and where you think that has a role, both from a perspective of maintaining quality of the offsets, but also in terms of its impact on sustainable development, as you indicated. So in the bank, for instance, the whole idea of a climate co-benefit linked to development investment has taken root and has found very champions in the various types of operations, and moving that towards looking more broadly at sustainable development impacts or goals, as you've indicated. Yeah. And what would be the role of, say, standards which need or better understand these kind of goals? And it's an opportunity for you to talk a little bit about the gold standard.
Yeah, well, don't cut that out later.
No, definitely.
There's a great deal of focus at the moment on the amount of money that's going to climate action or the amount of money that's going to the Sustainable Development Goals. I actually don't think that's terribly important. What I think is more important is the impact of that money being spent, and what that money being spent is doing to improve the lives of people in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals. So one of the things I do at the moment is serve as the president of something called the Gold Standard Foundation, which, not on its own, but working together with a number of organizations, including working together with the World Bank, has developed a gold standard for the global goals. So an instrument that allows you to assess what the Sustainable Development Goal impact of your investments is going to be, in addition to the carbon emission reductions that you achieve, and thereby to ensure that those things are real, that they're top standard, that they're verified, that they're independently certified, and that they're really good, and people appreciate that. I mean, if I go back in time to our earlier conversation at the time, or shortly after the Kyoto Protocol, another instrument that was that existed was joint implementation.
Yes.
And we were given the opportunity at that time to buy emission reductions that were from a former Eastern European country, emission reductions that were not the result of any action, but the results of factories closing down because they were just not competitive anymore. So it was hot air, and it was incredibly cheap. But I said, I am not going to spend the money of taxpayers, money that people have worked for, to buy garbage. So in the same way, I think it's worthwhile having independently formulated standards, and the gold standard does that, working together with the bank, with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, with many other organizations, to develop something that gives an investor the confidence that what they're buying is a real contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals and not greenwashing.
Yeah. And in conclusion, there are a lot of young people now at a place like the World Bank working on a range of climate change issues. And what would your advice be, having spent a large proportion of your professional life working for addressing this risk of climate change? What is your advice to the younger ones?
Well, twofold. First would be the wise words of Bob Marley, that in this great future you can't forget your past. So learn from the past, look back, learn from the mistakes that others have made, be aware of those sensitivities, and then, as it were, put that aside and do what young people are best at, which is to think out of the box, to think free, to be innovative, to break new ground, and to develop things that will resonate with the generations of today, not with the generations of yesterday. That's
an excellent advice, Yvo. So thank you very much, and as a beneficiary of your wisdom over the years and the effectiveness of the work you've done, not just in the Dutch government, but at the UNFCCC and at GGGI, I personally would like to thank you for all that you've done for this area.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Thanks.